Good morning, Arvind. How are you?
Good morning. So good to see you, Tyler. Hello, Fred.
Hello.
Terrific. Gary, do you want to get the ball rolling, sort of set the stage for us?
I think the ball is already rolling. I'm filled with emotion to be in even this much relationship with so many. And I see so many people who've been such an important part of my life for years, and people who I suspect will be an important part of our life for years to come, who I only know by face right now. So I'm deeply moved about where we stand in this journey of shared work. Nothing can actually stop life. Life, as Heather taught us, always finds a way. And that's what we're doing this morning, is finding our way.
I just want to welcome the Leading Causes of Life Fellows in particular, who have been trying to gather for many years and who are meant to be together from today over the next 3 days in El Paso with you, Arvind. And it's wonderful that we can still do something like this together. I've seen additional people, Heidi Christensen from Washington, and Ken Pargerman from Bowling Green, and Ellen Eidler from Emory, and others on board. And for those who don't know the fellows, they are people in a variety of disciplines and practice fields, some in the academy, some in institutions and organizations. Many are also on the ground in tough work on the ground, and all connected by basically one thing, and that is a conviction that it's worth paying attention to life as much as we pay attention to that which hurts or kills us.
Thank you. I welcome you from the beautiful campus of the University of Texas, El Paso. What you see beyond these beautiful buildings is the city of Ciudad Juarez. And so we are right on the border with Mexico. We have several thousand students who cross the border every single day. We are grateful to be in a situation where we don't know if we've crossed the border or the border has crossed us. It's a bilingual, bicultural, binational environment, just the kind of place where magic happens. And how nice that we are extending through Zoom these borders across the oceans and to all the continents and places that you are joining us from. Some of us were in Washington, D.C. at the White House. I think there are at least 10 of us who are on the screen who were there, and you know who you are, taking part in an important meeting such as this. And the stars must have really aligned for us to have chosen to meet on this day. I'm a big fan of Margaret Mead, cultural anthropologist. As many of you may know, served as a curator at the American Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. for decades, along with her avocations and her travels and her teaching. Mead was once asked by a student what object represented the first sign of civilization in ancient cultures. And Mead said the first sign of civilization in an ancient culture was a femur that had been broken and that had healed. In the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you die. You know, your history. No animal survives a broken leg long enough for the bone to heal. However, in human societies, a broken femur that has healed suggests helping someone else through difficulty is where civilization starts, Mead said. I believe that's the reason why we are meeting here. I think that's the reason why we are on the Zoom call. We like to tend to the broken bones. We find joy in life-giving healing. And the question is, who are you? What life-giving work do you do? In what way do you deviate from the norm?
I think I heard a combination of wonderful gifts. On one hand, the power of capacity building and development and the work of communities. On the other hand, the power that as leaders, you have in working and creating systems that are much more functional. I think that I also listen to my peers say that creativity has this incredible magic to it. And all the conversations that I was privy to speak about how people are using their creativity and innovation as well. I love some of the examples of how, you lead from the point of being sort of like the disruptive force, being almost deviant in what you do. The highlights of service and weavers. I think that I picked up on keywords. How does one weave through life and through actions and through mission? Beautiful statements about how teaching, whether you're in the trenches with students, but nowadays primarily online, has become, I'm going to only speak for myself, a little bit uncomfortable, but it's the uncomfortable that is helping us to adapt and change. I don't like the term social distance. I would rather use the physical distance of. Great work around nonprofit organizations, deep commitment to the environment and to helping shape the next generation of professionals and practitioners. I love when Joko said, I work with communities. And what Ella said, my life is about working with people that have systems to ensure that they're much more functional in what they do. I love how our leaders and peers continue to say we're flipping the questions. Yes, I may be a pathologist, but at the end of the day, my charge is to go beyond disease, to really focus on protection of life and to really lead health and lead life in a meaningful way.
Nagesh Rao, Professor Nagesh Rao from Ohio University, chair of the social medicine program, maybe invite you for a minute of what stood out to you.
Thanks, Arvind, and thanks, Eva, so for eloquently putting together the conversations. And so I would say the really strong theme was how we start from the heart and how the hearts have to connect with each other.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Nagesh Rao, my dear friend of many years. Doug, what stood out for you?
I think a lot of really amazing observations have been made. I was looking for words that kind of popped out, and the word support came out sort of at least 50% of the time. I look forward to working, and I think we will be at some stage working with some of you in trying to bring out that astonishing practice that people like yourselves are developing to share creatively with the world. So thank you.
And so over to Gary and to Jim to talk about the leading causes of life. Why the leading causes of life?
The birth story of leading causes of life is based in the reaction to the public health language of the leading causes of death to frame choices. I started working on the book, Leading Causes of Life, and asked Larry Prey to help me write it. The very, very first sentence of the book was Larry's, and that is the extraordinary sentence, life has a language. So what's the language for? Paul Orienti, some years after that, told a group of LCL fellows that you really don't need leading causes of life language unless life is complex. It turns out life is complex. This is what teased Jonas Salk to also flip the most basic language of pandemic and epidemic to ask the question, what if in human communities health could spread like an epidemic? Life is not a problem, it's only a possibility. This is where Doug and Jim have been so helpful, along with others, I'm thinking of Jerry, help us find the philosophical guidance that this radical ambiguity we're in now is actually old news. We know how to be here. We just have to pause and reflect on those who have been here thinking deeply about it before us. The leading causes of life language is less the answer than the right question. When I speak with this about clergy or public health people, I say, you don't have to even remember 5 things, but when the committee you happen to be sitting on is facing what seems like a incomparable problem, simply ask the right question. Is there any life here to work with? There's always life here to work with. We just have to learn how to talk about it. Life does find a way among the places, people, and communities that we love. That's what the language is for. I'm going to stop there, hand it over to Jim.
What I want to do is share a couple of images. The 5 causes of life: agency, coherence, hope, connection, and intergenerativity, the last one we also call blessing, will be misunderstood if 2 things are not made clear. The first is it's not a tool set, and that's the way most people prefer to use it. It's more like a canopy, as Paul drew it then. They aren't a collection of static parts that you can just weld together like a little machine. They're actually angles of view on an organic whole, and through that whole it's life that flows and the sand blows. But the focus is human life. It's about how humans are present in the world, about, in fact, more precisely, an extraordinary set of capacities that mark us as being and becoming human in the first place. And if we forget that, we might as well forget the framework. The first fundamental capacity I want to refer to is agency. It's crucial to grasp what this means. I mean by it our creative freedom, as Doug and I have written a book trying to describe this. It's our causal capacity to change nature and ourselves in ways that nature couldn't do on its own. Why causal? Because it has profound effects in the world and on us. And even though it's an internal capacity that you can't empirically measure, it's extraordinary in its impact. This is a good way for me. I love using this example. It's a symphony orchestra. It happens to be the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, playing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, its choral symphony, and the sound it produces is awe-inspiring. What one needs to create that sound is itself extraordinary, though. It's not just the skills of the musicians and the conductor and the people playing in exquisite harmony, but it's the instruments that have been built by someone, craftspeople. It's the precise wood that was harvested and honed for that. It's the strings someone spun. It's the paper someone invented, the notes written on it, the ink someone made. It's a massive collaborative accomplishment spanning literally hundreds of years and probably as many people, well beyond the orchestra. All of that is possible because we are able to add to nature something that's not in it. Symbols, symbolic systems like languages and mathematics, which enable us to imagine what's possible and bring it into being. And the orchestra demonstrates that too. That's how it's possible to know what to play when and to produce this extraordinary sound. We all know too well that we are highly capable of using our creative freedom to destroy as much as we can constructively use it. The freedom itself, the creative freedom, is good. What we intend with it is ambiguous. We have to choose which it is to be. So in that sense, we can choose life or death. It's not as if life is divorced from the realities of death. This picture is a COVID-19 picture in Johannesburg, near Johannesburg in South Africa, just from a couple of days ago. So the leading causes of life is in the midst of this. It's the ironies of this social distancing are not absent from it. It's not happy talk. Like all potent metaphors, it's meant to break open new meaning and action in order to be human, become human, and to make sure that others have that capacity too. We are capable of being of producing as great evil as we are good. That's obvious. But we are also capable of great good, and in that I want to add the last cause lies hope. So let me turn finally to the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra again. The photo you saw before is cropped from this one. It's actually the performance of the Ninth Symphony in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin on the day, 30 years later, that the wall in Berlin came down. There are others trying to build walls again, whether they are metaphorical walls or real walls. They are what damage and disrupt and destroy our lives. The symphony ends with Schiller's Ode to Joy, which is meant to be something the world takes to heart. It's an anthem for humanity itself, as Beethoven meant it. It's something that the analyst again calls a gigantic, irrefutable musical power as a wellspring of endless renewal and possibility. So to end, humans built the Berlin Wall and many other walls. Humans not least those that began the Monday marches out of the Nikolai Church in Leipzig, helped tear down that wall. This is an example of agency, coherence, connection, intergenerativity, and hope all in one.
Wow. Okay, so positive deviance involves several mental somersaults. We do these mental somersaults to ask an improbable, life-giving question. Now, we are going to do mental somersaults with three people. Let's call them three giants, giants on whose shoulders we stand. And they are giants in many ways, but I think most importantly, and this has been mentioned before, they are giants because they have an ethical, moral character that we all aspire to. Now, Lincoln, some of you may know, was tall, and he always loved wearing his stovepipe hat. So, that would make him a 7-footer. There's a story of Lincoln once being asked, "Mr. President, you're tall," and this was a petty soldier who was shaking his hand, and he asked Mr. Lincoln, "How tall are you?" And if I were Lincoln, I certainly am not, or if it were somebody else, perhaps the response would be, "I am 6'4" tall, or "I am 6'4.5" inches tall. And that is what we expect from those who know, who have a certain vernacular, a certain language, a certain expertise. We are so precise when it comes to height. However, Lincoln's response, without batting an eyelid, to a question that was, "Mr. President, you're tall, how tall are you?" was, "Son, like you, tall enough that my feet reach the ground." What Lincoln is saying, that there is wisdom in the common ground. Some of you know, I had a long-standing correspondence relationship with Mother Teresa. And the story of Mother Teresa that is relevant here is when she was in Washington, D.C. in 1974 at Dulles Airport. There were about 1,000 people who walked up to her with placards. They were planning a march in Washington, and they asked her, "Mother, will you march with us against the Vietnam War?" And there was a long silence. And Mother then said, "My child, if you're going to have a march in Washington against the Vietnam War, I am so sorry. But my child, if you were to choose to have a march in Washington for peace, I will be the first to lead." Here's the father of the Indian nation, Rashtrapita. We also called him Bapu, lovingly, father. And of course, the world also called him Mahatma, a great soul. And the father of the Indian nation, if you look to the top left of your screen, in a train coach, always traveled by 3rd class. You're the father of the Indian nation, you should go 1st class. And Bapu's response always was, "I travel 3rd class because, as you know, there is no 4th class." Too often as problem solvers, we begin by identifying with what we are up against. What's the problem? What are the gaps? What are the deficits? What is not working? We should always ask the somersault question. What are we for? What are the assets? What's working? Too often we get all caught up in best practices. Nothing wrong with it. What Gandhi is saying is, if you could factor in the 4th class and their perspective and their point of view in the calculus that you have for problem solving, you will be at a different place. You will be at a life-giving place. Let's see how we can bring these 3 triple somersaults to ask a question, as Gary said, a life-giving question, because life is always there. A question that has never ever been asked before. A question that was asked in 1990s by Monique and Jerry Sternin to address the issue of malnutrition in Vietnam. And this is my favorite picture of Jerry, because whenever you sat across from him, he always did these flips, and basically he's saying, flip, flip, do that somersault. And the question was simply, question that had never been asked before, are there children under the age of 5 from very poor rural households, the kind of ones where you expect malnutrition to be rampant, that are well nourished? And the answer, out of 3,000 kids in 4 communities that they started out with, yes, there's some 24 children. Among the 3,000, that's less than 1%. The positive deviance because they are not the norm. The norm is that if you have those conditions, you are malnourished. Positive because they have solved the problem. And of course, if you want to bring in the very poor rural households, is Gandhi's 4th class, that are well nourished, is Mother Teresa's "What are you for?" We are for nourishment. What is it that's uncommon that they do? And it was the community who actually went out to self-discover that. And of course, these uncommon practices, in order for them to have any value, for them to be life-giving, need to be accessible to all. So this is what was found in Vietnam. It's a complicated story and it's very well documented, but I'm going to give you some highlights. They found out that amongst these children who were well nourished, who shouldn't have been, their mothers would take the sweet potato greens. Now, we all know the sweet potato. In fact, when we use language, we are interested in the sweet potato. We do not think about the greens. The greens are usually fed to the cows and goats, and or used as compost. In this case, the mothers of these well-nourished kids were adding the greens of sweet potato to their meals. The mothers were also adding, and this was non-normative, they were taking these teeny tiny shrimps and crabs that grows in rice fields and shellfish, which were not considered to be human food. And they would pick these up. And of course, they were there for the plenty, and come back home and remove the crust and have a little pulp and a little protein. Again, adding the greens and the sweet, adding the greens of the sweet potato and adding these little shrimps and crabs were non-normative practices. But the resources were accessible to all because the wisdom to solve the problem was now located by asking an improbable question. Another thing that they found was that kids who were well nourished, who shouldn't have been, were actively fed by their mother. And if a mother wasn't around because she was working in the field, they were actively fed by a sibling. The normative practice was that if a child could sit, and if you are a few months old or maybe a year, you get a bowl of whatever and you eat some and you waste some and you leave some and you drop some. Active feeding made sure that the child got the last grain. And more importantly, perhaps, it created an ethic of care around the child with the caregiver, the mother, and the siblings that several times a day manifest itself in the act of connecting with the child through active feeding. Now, how were these practices adopted once you discover this wisdom? And here there is another flip in positive deviance. In positive deviance, you don't tell people. You don't show them. You basically create the conditions for them to practice. So cooking sessions were held where women were invited to pick up tiny greens from sweet potato plants and tiny shrimps and crabs and bring them to the cooking session where they would cook, practice, where they would feed their children, where they would actively feed their kids. They were the ones who tracked their child's progress. And this is what happened in Vietnam, that number going up. It's a very well documented case. Researchers at Emory University, I know several of you are there from Emory. I know, Gary, you spent time there. Vietnam was a test case. It worked quite beautifully. The approach has been refined. The deviating practice, which has led to well-nourished kids, is evidence itself. we've got some publications. And now I'm going to invite 5 of my colleagues from 5 different parts of the world to tell us how they have taken the practice of positive deviance, the framework of positive deviance in their own little worlds.
Hello to all, by the way, from the Sun City here in El Paso, Texas. My study focused on the intra and interpersonal communication acts and behaviors of positive deviant PD Latinx living on the US-Mexico border that effectively manage their diabetes. I worked with the local El Paso Diabetes Association for recruitment. I mailed about 600 invitations out. I received 47 completed questionnaires, and 12 met the criterion of my PD study. And the question was, are there people who are residents of El Paso, Texas, who are Latinx, diagnosed with type 2 diabetes with an A1C level below 6.4 for 1 year or more, taking 1 or no oral diabetes medications, with no insulin intake and no weight loss surgery? So overall, interpersonal behavior, the communication that one has with oneself, revealed that PD respondents did not characterize diabetes, including its diagnosis, as a mark of stigma. PDs did not feel stigmatized, which led to interpersonal communication strategy of diabetes diagnosis disclosure. So this was the key finding. So they disclosed to family, friends, and coworkers, which garnered greater social support and brings us back to what we talked about at the beginning, that this is a heart-filled study full of vulnerability that found support. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. It's good to see you. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Kasilik. I'm currently an assistant professor of mental health law and policy at the University of South Florida. But previously, I spent 4 wonderful years at the University of Texas at El Paso. I see so many faces that I miss so much. Arvind has been a mentor of mine, one of the first people I met when I moved to El Paso, Texas from Chicago. And he invited me to learn PD through doing. And so I had a relationship with the Oklahoma Department of Rehabilitation Services. I'm a rehabilitation counselor. It was serendipity. And so we partnered with our wonderful colleagues who we came to call the Fab Four at OKDRS to ask the question, are there case managers, folks who are providing support to people with psychiatric disabilities in particular in OKDRS, who have high proportions of their caseloads that are serving people with psychiatric disability? They tend to struggle significantly with finding employment, who are not using additional resources such as more intensive supports, yet who are successfully closing a large portion of their cases. And what we mean by case closures is helping people get jobs. And so just one example of a micro behavior that was uncovered through this work was that when a participant with a disability who was seeking employment completed a job interview successfully, they would get a handwritten congratulatory card in the mail from their case manager. Of course, there were numerous other behaviors that were uncovered, but that's just one example. And now I'm so excited to be working with teams of people here in Tampa to bring a PD learning community here to help transition age youth with mental health conditions. So thank you so much for having me.
Kristen, I'm going to go to India and I'm going to invite Anu and Pallavi. Go right ahead.
Sending big hugs to everyone. I went to UTEP from 2012 to 2014, where I started learning about positive deviance by doing it, like Kristen was saying with Dr. Singhal. And since then, have been able to use it around the world for large-scale public health, social change, communication programs, not just as a methodology to do some innovative work, but as a mindset for creating narratives that have lost their normalcy. The goodness has lost normalcy. The small things that make a big difference has lost normalcy. And thanks to Oklahoma Project, had we not had you, we would not have been able to do that. So this is rural India, and women, as you know, are subjected to all sorts of gender barriers. But we asked a very improbable question. Are there women entrepreneurs in rural India who, in fact, despite all their odds, are able to succeed at the business that they do. And one of the very dear stories, and very dear to Pallavi and I, is because it involves chai. Tea, as you all know it. And if you all know me, then you know that tea is a very dear part of my life. And this one woman entrepreneur, she said, I don't hold on to customers by saying, buy my product, or look at this unique thing, or look what's new in the market. But I try to hold on to the customer as not a customer, but a place for gossip in chai. And these rural women entrepreneurs, despite not having that education, that background, that university behind them, they were able to make a very good life for them, make social life out of it, and not just money life out of it. And I think that's what is very central to the work that we do at the Change Designers, of how do we enhance life outcomes. And we've been able to use positive deviance with health, with reproduction, with environment, with entrepreneurship, like I just said, and we're very, very proud to be doing it. So thank you, Dr. Singhal. Thank you, Dr. Moya, for making us able in doing this.
Keep doing the terrific work that you are doing. And now we go, believe it or not, I have a Dutch sister, and I've known her for 30 years. And I have had the pleasure and privilege of working with her through the years in many countries on many projects. And she's going to tell you about our first Positive Deviance project in Netherlands, I hope. So over to Martine.
Thank you, Arvind, for the introduction. Yes, as the founder and the scientific director of the Center for Media and Health, I'm very much interested in public health and the power of storytelling. Also to reach deprived groups and people who have low health literacy. So Arvind, we met indeed a long time ago, and during your frequent visit at the center, you told me about the positive deviance strategy, and I really loved that very much, because the idea of identifying and amplifying existing wisdom is superb. It's like kind of intuitive yes. We started to collaborate on the first large-scale positive deviance project in 2011. It became also an award-winning project, and we focused on students who come from an immigrant background, who are living in a deprived neighborhood in a big city in Rotterdam, and who are on a low vocational training school. We found a teacher who called the parents, and those were parents with a Turkish or Moroccan background who never visited the school when they were invited for a parents' meeting. And they decided to call the parents to give a compliment to their son or to their daughter when they had really done a good job, for example, at the opening of a school festivity. They were so kind to take the coats and to give coffee and tea. And so they gave a compliment to the parents for the child. While normally, you all who have children may know that often the teachers call the parents when the children didn't do their homework, when they were absent from school, or when they did some other naughty things. So imagine what it means when teachers call parents to compliment their children. So these were some micro behaviors that really helped to give a kind of inclusion and also to give a positive vibe for parents with children on this school. So when we talk about mental somersaults, we also had to learn how to flip the coin and how to really focus on a different mindset ourselves, because we were trained like the traditional researchers. We have experienced that the data-driven, because we use data, hard data from the Youth Monitor studies in the Netherlands, to really find several micro behaviors that were really challenging. And we filmed also these micro behaviors, and we use them at the moment for teaching modules for post-academic people in the health communication sector. So this was our experience, and it was really nice that we could have this grant to do this large-scale project.
Questions that are being asked by our colleagues is there life here? And can we ask the right questions? And then we go all the way to Tel Aviv, and is my friend Anat there?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Professor Anat Gessedelsbo from Haifa University. I'm the head of the Health Promotion Program at School of Public Health. A few years ago, you, my dear colleague, Professor Arvind Singhal, invited me to a workshop of researchers from all over the world. So I went to Oxford, England, and there I got the inspiration to explore PD. Today, we are currently conducting a study in the Bedouin society in the south of Israel, in the Negev desert, on children's safety using the PD approach. The rates of injury and death of children from the Arab society are very high. During the research with the mothers and children, we asked the children to draw a playing environment they would like for themselves. One of the interesting findings from their drawings was that the safe playing area for them was the mosque. So we created a short clip where the children themselves appealed to the imams to use the mosques as a safe space for them to play in. The imam in the town of Lakia got on board and asked us to do the project in his town. And with the whole community, including the men, we created a playroom for the children. It was very exciting to see it, and I can't wait to see what else is going to be in this project. So thank you.
We love you all for all the wonderful work that you do with so much passion, asking questions that have not been asked, looking for life which has existed, and finding ways to give it. Gary, I know you were going to set up the fishbowl conversation.
And I do appreciate the chance to do this. You'll see enormous synergy between this. Although we frame this particular Zoom as the intersection between positive deviance and leading cause of life, what we already see in this small group is that that's not the name of the actual movement that's happening. The movement, perhaps like theology, has many, many names. And almost everyone on the Zoom call has probably 3 or 4 different movements of which they are a part. So if you had a social network map, it would have the name of probably hundreds of social movements that we think would all work a little better if they were informed by the flipping of positive deviance and the underpinning of a philosophy of leading cause of life. And they may not even need either one. It may be the exact opposite. We may be informed the other way. So we've asked Saha from the Wellbeing in the Nation Network, Craig Stewart in Cape Town, the Warehouse Trust, and Bobby Milstein of Rethink Health and the Ripple Foundation to talk first sort of to each other. The idea here is we're sort of listening in to a conversation about how their work might actually illuminate the leading causes of life and the positive deviance approach. So we're not asking them to talk about how PD and LCL are informing them, but actually the flip opposite of that question, and how are these approaches may well be informed by what they understand about our collective work with the world.
So much of this is about less about how things are separate and more about how life feeds and informs each other, how we're connected. Some of our biggest opportunities is in recognizing that actually, if we trust in life and recognize that there may be systems of inequity that are preventing some of that life from getting out, and that if we were to work together to remove some of those systems that come from legacies of racism and other forms where we believed we needed to be separate from one another or hold things to ourselves to have life, that life for ourselves or our people came at a cost to that of others, and we were willing to tolerate that cost. If we abandon that belief to believe that working together to release those legacies and build new legacies of life where we give life to one another and release that potential, that we're more abundant together. in this moment in time, it seems so important not only to socially connect with one another around the globe, even if in the context of physical distancing, but to connect the dots between what we need for all the things we need to have life, to truly thrive. That isn't just found within our hospital walls, that those are critical, but also what we need in terms of food, in terms of kindness, in terms of community, and in terms of that ability to get together over chai and gossip, and to belong to one another. And I think if we can't approach this in a connected way, we may well stop or mitigate the impact of lives lost without mitigating the impact of hope and the other dimensions of life lost. And I think on the flip side, we have an opportunity to truly show the connection amongst ourselves and amongst the vital conditions that create life.
Yeah, well, so I can certainly pick up on that in that, I guess the first thing I'll say about movements and where leading causes of life and positive deviance can be seen as at work are really in each of the frontiers where our life feels like it's in flux or contested or endangered, but also, carried within that jeopardy is the possibility of real expansion, of real flourishing. And there's these sort of very strange and difficult to hold contradictions in the moment of, so much it seems improbable, like the impossible is actually happening, to bring an entire economy to the halt. And yet that demonstrates that so much is possible. And we see this whether we look through a lens of health or reimagining capitalism or ways of looking at environmental sustainability, democracy. These are some of the different areas of innovation. I spent a long time in my career working at the Centers for Disease Control. I'm proud for a lot of the work we do, but also consistently frustrated at an ethos that felt very inhumane and technocratic at many times, putting science in the foreground and almost eclipsing issues of consciousness and conscience. The main publication that CDC puts out is the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which I always saw as sort of the lifestyles of the dead and dying. What could we learn by publishing weekly the lifestyles of the dead and dying? And I had sort of from that point on tried to find the humanity that we could bring in the foreground, the interdependence that we could bring into the foreground, and the productive aspects of not only what are we trying to prevent and control, but what are we trying to create? And that has led straight line to what Shoma said as being, articulating the vital conditions that we depend on and recognizing that it is we feeling some sense of belonging and civic muscle that actually create those conditions and are responsible for who has them and who doesn't. And what are we doing to expand those vital conditions for everyone? And if not, to what degree are we in some ways complicit in the harm that we're all feeling? And so I'll stop there and we'll move on to other thinkers here.
Greetings to everybody. Lovely to be greeting you from Cape Town, South Africa. Nice to see some of the faces I know, and nice to hear your voices, Shoma. I loved Bobby's comments on system stewardship and thinking about that. We, Warehouse, work primarily within sort of faith and congregational communities around South Africa, and particularly within the Cape Town Metro, and then alongside civil society. And one of the things that's particularly interested me in the kind of leading causes of life notions is around connectivity and generativity. And how we find those connection points that aren't otherwise visible, and the sort of informal networks that exist, and how you nurture life in those. If you looked at a forest and said, what do we need to nurture life here? You wouldn't be saying, look after the fungus. And yet the fungus turns out to be critical to this system stewardship. And so what is the fungus in a network? And so a lot of our work has been, when you look at a system or a city or a country, where are those fungal networks that exist? That how do you work within those networks to create bonded moments of friendship, of connection, of relationship, but also where the life in our lives that sometimes is hidden is given an opportunity to surface. The sort of yearning for more, the yearning for what could be. A banding opportunity to bring people of that like life together to be talking and finding each other, not across institutional coherence necessarily, but building relational connections, and then moving into beginning to build some form of institutional coherence around that, and then creating connection. The last part is bridging, creating connections with that life to other bits of life in other parts of the world and cities. A couple of years ago, we were running out of water in the city of Cape Town. We were but days away from running out of water. And a couple of years before that, we were facing student uprisings all over the country in what was called Fees Must Fall. And what those years have created is effectively in WhatsApp groups, but these networks of friends who share a desire for life, who when these moments happen, find each other quite quickly and start talking about how they can work together in those spaces. That has led to hundreds of peace and justice monitors operating initially in a student uprising context, and now as cities try and implement homelessness solutions or settlements or healthcare, those networks are emerging to take care of that. They're not an organization, they're not named, but present there in the existence of life. They've nurtured the emergence of disaster relief initiatives in the face of large-scale informal settlement fires. And so I'm particularly interested in this fungus network, this network of mushrooms that connect all the big trees, that bring the life between them, that keeps the learning up and down, that has tremendous capacity, I think, to nurture life in systems.
One problem of the language of leading cause of life is that it's a little bit too sermonic. It's a little bit too inspirational. It's too easy to be, and it's not intended to be language of metaphor. It's actually intended to be more accurate. So when you describe fungal networks, it's not a metaphor. You're not using that as a metaphor. You're trying to accurately describe how the hell things actually work. That's actually the deep link with positive deviance, which is very inspirational. But the whole work of positive deviance is to look in a different way at the data, so it's more accurate. It helps us see what we have to work with.
You see that all the things we've been talking about, the resilience of communities, the assets of those who are quote unquote marginalized, et cetera, those are what come forward as the great blessings we have. The fungus and the network of, it's just such a different way of thinking about connecting. And I think our ability to translate these ideas into measures that better reflect life, so that we can have measures of life, so that we're not just talking about the lifestyles of the dead and dying, and the language to go with that is just so inspiring.
I want to invite Carla Alvarado.
Thank you so much, Gary. And yes, there are a lot of things that we do out of rote repetition and just arbitrariness that can be addressed and readdressed through this framework of positive deviance and the leading causes of life. You cannot unsee it. It's a practice. It takes intentionality. And you are trying to solve a problem to tackle it right then and there, not to keep pondering about it and say that more studies are needed to understand this, right? And that's what I loved about the research that I read on positive deviance, is that it did not conclude with more research is needed. We found a solution. The people in these very kind of monolithic and strict institutions are also trying to break that mold, and that sadly sometimes that is not fostered and it's not rewarded, and then people find more creative ways of carrying out their talents and lending them to the community. Now that we know that we can do a lot more with a lot less, and that it takes will and intentionality, that let those be guided through the perspective of positive deviance. You know, you can be a bit subversive with positive things too, but if someone won't take their medicine, you just got to put a little sugar on it. So
we know you can do it.
I think the word I've heard the most here in the fishbowl is connection. Shoma's phrase that we are more abundant together, and I guess I would say exactly more alive together. Thank you, Craig, for the reminder about the mycelium that gather, that connect the trees and share the nutrients from tree to tree, something we've learned a lot more about since the long time ago when I first encountered Gary Gunderson through a book he wrote, Deeply Woven Roots. At that time, we didn't know so much about how these trees connect, but now we do.
I was very struck by the phrase that we must discover our own inheritance. I think that rediscovering that we can trust what we already know or knew is terribly important in this. I was also very struck earlier by Jim's statement that we are called to be responsible for life. What gives the leading causes and the positive deviance its energy is curiosity about what is invisible. And I must say my attitude toward the media has totally changed thanks to Bobby. We now know it's all about the lifestyles of the dead and dying. It's so wonderful to see your faces. Thanks.
Bobby, I love what you said about how we have learned how rapidly fundamental change can happen. Well, let's do some more of that. And I'm very eager to see how we capture this and feed the broader movement that has many names.
What fires have been lit, what buckets have been filled, what life now seems possible. Let me just say on behalf of the University of Texas, El Paso, all my wonderful colleagues, and Carla, we claim you as one of our own, and the global collaborators and this wonderful fellowship of the leading causes of life fellows. It's deeply, deeply inspiring. This is life-giving. And thank you all for uplifting at least me and hopefully others too.
Thank you, Arvind.
Cheers.
Thank you, Arvind.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Gary.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank
Be
you,
well.
Arvind,
everyone.
Gary,
Bye
Jim,
bye.
Mother.
Fantastic.
Well.
I'm so happy that I was able to join.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Be well.
Wash your hands.
Up to your elbows.
Thank you. Thank you.
20 seconds.
All right,
Good night, all.
my friends. Lovely. I think since I initiated it, I may be the one to click that beautiful red button. But please know that I'll be very happy to click it on again anytime.
Thank
Bye.
Sweet potato shoots. Bring your sweet potato shoots. Sweet potato shoots. Bring your sweet potato